Welcome to the San Francisco Writers Conference podcast, a celebration of craft, commerce, and community. I'm your host, Matthew Félix, and I'm here today with Margaret Rodenberg, an avid traveler who has visited over 60 countries. Margaret has journeyed more than 30,000 miles to conduct Napoleonic research, including to St. Helena Island in the remote South Atlantic. Margaret is director of the Napoleonic Historical Society, a nonprofit that promotes knowledge of the Napoleonic era. And on her website, margaretrodenberg.com, she reports on Napoleon's ongoing presence in world culture. Finding Napoleon is her first novel, and it's already off to a fantastic start. She has Finding Napoleon has won a gold Ippy for best new fiction, as well as 4 other awards. And I should mention that the way I came in contact with Margaret was through the Writers' Conference, where she has been awarded her books, including this one. A previous version of Finding Napoleon were awarded first place for fiction. So welcome, Margaret.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me.
I'm very excited to have you. I loved this book. I will tell you, and this is one of the highest compliments I think we can get, is I did not want the book to end. So thank you for that. Thank you for the characters and the setting and the story. And we're going to talk all about it, obviously. But yeah, I really sincerely enjoyed it. So thanks. Thanks for that. And I'm looking forward to talking all about it. So for people who don't know, can you just give us sort of an overview of what the book is about?
Yes. It's Finding Napoleon's based in part on a novel that young Napoleon Bonaparte actually tried to write. And in Finding Napoleon, I have the exiled, defeated emperor finish his youthful novel, but from his perspective, while he is in exile on St. Helena Island in the South Atlantic. And part of that story also is about his love affair with his last love affair of his life with the Countess Albine. And it's what the story is really how his novel is about how this guy came out of nowhere, out of Corsica, and became one of the most important leaders in Western history. And then what was left of him when the power was gone. And those were the 2 parts that interested me about Napoleon. I leave out entirely the whole story of wars and battles and geopolitics. So it's just a focus on the person and what made him what he was.
Right. And I just love this notion that he tried to write a novel and he didn't finish it. I believe the novel still exists, and I saw that you actually got your hands on it. So can you tell us kind of, first of all, how did you find out about the novel? And then how did you end up actually coming face to face with it?
So about 20 years ago, I came across the fact, just in a history book, I think it was Will Durant's History of Civilization, one of those volumes, that Napoleon had tried to write a novel when he was 26 years old. And that was before he'd met Josephine. It was before he was already a general, but he was an impoverished general at that point. And that the novel still existed, that those pages still existed. It was only about 15 pages long, but it has a whole story arc in it. So it's a romantic story of a young soldier who goes through love and betrayal and becomes a leader, a tragic leader, in fact, in his book. So as soon as I found out about it, I vowed to finish it for him. And that was partially because when I was a kid, I'd lived in France, and I remembered so well all the heroic stories about Napoleon. That was my memory of him. But I recognized also that he was still a kind of a stick figure in my mind when I learned about his new novel, his old novel. So I vowed if I was going to finish it, I had to understand who he was as a person. And that took a lot of time, a lot of effort, because really most Americans, we think of him as, this short guy in a big hat with his hand in his vest and strutting around. That's all we really know about him. But so I read, and I did my own translation because I still do speak some French well, of what he had written. And I found actually that 4 pages of it were in Santa Barbara.
Oh, really? In Santa Barbara? Wow.
Santa Barbara,
That's
California.
that's not what I thought you were about to say. Interesting.
No, most of the rest of it is in Poland. So that wasn't what you thought I was
Didn't
going to
expect that
say.
either. I kept thinking Les Invalides or someplace. Yeah.
No,
Corsica, someplace. Interesting.
no,
Okay.
no. So it was in the hands of those 4 pages were in the hands of a private collector,
Right.
Dr. Capelli's, and I wrote him an email and told him what I was doing and asked him if I could see it the next time I was in California. I live in Virginia,
Mhm.
and he said, sure, just send me an email when you're coming. And I did that. I showed up at his door, and he handed me the book in the pages, the original pages, and said, "Go for it. Sit down and do whatever you'd like and
Wow.
read it."
Wow.
And it was
what was that? Yeah.
inspiring.
What was that like? How did that feel?
You know, thankfully I had my husband with me, and he and Dr. Carpeles sat down and talked about New York City and talked about all sorts of things. And I just was left alone with these things in my hand, looking at them.
Mhm.
And, it takes a certain kind of person, I think, to be a fiction writer. So you, while I'm not a religious or even I don't think of myself as a particularly spiritual person. I am somebody who feels, I think, the spirit coming out of a document like that.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the person is in front of me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that I'm feeling their feelings. So it was very emotional for me
Mm-hmm.
to sit and do that.
Yeah.
And
How long did you get to spend with it?
I was there for a couple hours with him.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it was quite remarkable.
I love that.
Yeah, and it's only probably in terms of Finding Napoleon, in terms of the book Finding Napoleon, it's only probably surpassed by my experience of actually going to St. Helena Island,
Okay.
where he was finally exiled
Right.
and died.
Right. And we're going to talk about that.
Okay.
About that. So hold off on St. Helena.
Okay.
I want to go back a step, if I may, and just talk about, you mentioned in the States, kind of, we have these sort of cliche associations, those of us who haven't necessarily studied world history or French history, about Napoleon being short and wearing the hat and the hand and all of those things that you just cited. You mentioned in the author's notes also that, he's both revered and reviled. So can you just give us a little context of sort of both sides of that coin at a high level, insofar as who he was, and both sides, like I said, of that coin, of how he's perceived?
Sure. That's a question that people spend their lives.
We could do a series. You'll come back and we'll do a series on this question.
Right.
So just the very high level. Yeah.
Right. There's a podcast of 50-hour sessions that will go through all that.
Really? Yeah, exactly. Oh,
yes.
there is one that actually exists.
There is one that actually exists.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
It was done by David Markham. But so Napoleon is in almost all ways two sides to a coin in everything you find out about him. So here is this guy who is both ruthless and romantic. Here is somebody who is an absolute intellectual, but also denies the and he's a part of the Enlightenment, but he also is a very big conservative emotionally. So he's both a revolutionary and a conservative in how he lives and what he does with with how he runs the country. So he saves the French Revolution, and he bases the way it works on the tenets of the French Revolution, which included that advancement through merit, not birthright, which we kind of think of as an American point of view, but it's really not. It came long before we took it on, and he was very much like that. Among his generals were people whose fathers were carpenters and barrel makers and bakers, and he didn't care where you came from. He cared what you could do. On the other hand, he was very conservative, for example, in his treatment of women. He did not think that that women should be in politics. And he's sometimes reviled as a misogynist. I don't view him as that. I view him as a man of his time. And the French Revolution was not about giving women. The French didn't give the women the right to vote until 1945, which is an amazing thing. Yeah. 1945. And we're talking 1802 that Napoleon really came into power. So he's got that. Now, the other thing that he did that he's really reviled for is slavery in Haiti. Mm-hmm. The island of Haiti had been a French colony. I'll try to make this fast. Again, it's a 3-hour conversation. But the island of Haiti had been a French colony for more than 100 years, and it provided the wealth that those kings squandered on their own lifestyle and on wars and on Versailles. And it created an incredible industry because Haiti at that time provided more than 50% of the coffee and sugar that was consumed by Europe. An amazing statistic.
Hard to imagine. Yeah.
Well, it did it through what is probably the worst form of slavery that I have certainly ever read about. It was the most brutal slavery. I've read statistics that say that the average Black brought from Africa into slavery to work in the fields in Haiti lived 2 years before they died.
Oh, wow.
It was a terrible, terrible place.
Yep.
So when the French Revolution came around, the French actually voted to end slavery in all of their colonies. So that became a law in France during the French Revolution. It didn't really happen everywhere because obviously nobody wanted to give up their slaves. But there were revolutions in lots of places, and one of those places was Haiti. And the revolution was still going on. It still had not been said. There was terrible slaughter on both sides. Whites slaughtered blacks, blacks slaughtered whites. It was a terrible situation, but the blacks had nothing to lose because of the kind of life they were living. The slaves had nothing to lose.
Right.
So when Napoleon came in, France was bankrupt, and the wolves were at the door, ready to rip apart France and divide it into this part will be Austria, this part of Normandy will go back to England, etc.
Right.
And it would have probably been the end of France if Napoleon hadn't come in and done many of the things he did. So here we have Napoleon saved France, perhaps. But it was bankrupt. He did a lot of things to put it back on its feet. But one of the things that he did, and he had been advised to do and had held off from doing it for a long time, but then he did it, was he reinstated slavery in Haiti.
Right.
Or let's say he reinstated it legally and then tried to make it a reality. He sent 40,000 French troops or so there. Half of them died of yellow fever. The other half had their tails whooped by the revolutionaries in Haiti. And they went home. Napoleon gave up on the New World.
Yep. Gave us Louisiana.
Gave us Louisiana, which made a whole difference in this country. And one thing I like to say is that this country ought to be more grateful to those relatives, to those rebels in Louisiana for making us the country that we are. Because without that, Napoleon would not have sold Louisiana Purchase.
Right.
So that's a big reason why he's reviled.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
And then, of course, all the wars that were taking place are referred to during his time are referred to as Napoleonic Wars, even though wars have been going on in Europe for decades and hundreds of years before and after. And some of them he started. Some of them were imposed on him because he didn't want to give up what had been won.
Had won, right.
So you got this mixture.
Yes, a very interesting mixture.
Yes.
There are, so I mean, you've obviously done so much research, and we're going to talk more about your research. But I'm just curious. I saw somewhere in your book, or maybe it was on your website. I can't remember where I saw this statistic that there are 60,000 books written about Napoleon.
Yeah.
So, were you at all trepidatious about throwing your hat into the ring, insofar as you're going to come under even more scrutiny than you might otherwise, right? Any thoughts on? Wait, there, so many people know so much here. Thoughts on that? Thoughts on tackling a subject that so many other people have tackled?
Hubris.
Uh-huh.
Well, first of all, my husband thinks that I bought most of those 60,000 books.
Probably. I don't doubt
it.
I see some of them behind you, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there, just as I said, Napoleon, revered and reviled, there are people, and I know many of them, who can argue every little last detail of every troop movement in Waterloo or any other parts of Napoleonic history. And then there is a huge portion of certainly the Americans who know next to nothing about Napoleon. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't writing a book for the experts.
Right.
So I didn't pretend to be, and I don't pretend to be a historian. I'm a fiction writer.
Right. And you already said, and I was going to ask you more about this anyway, but I want to bring this up again. The notion that you weren't interested so much in the battles and the wars and the soldier and the politician as you were, the man. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? The man, what was it that made you want to know more about him in that sense versus the soldier and the politician?
Well, number one, I'm really not interested in the troop movements. Uh-huh. So that just never appealed to me to begin with.
Right.
But as I said to you, I came out of being a young teen who lived in France, who had this romantic idea of who Napoleon was. I lived in the south of France, not far from where Napoleon landed when he escaped from his first exile on Elba. And what happened then was he and 800 troops marched 500 miles to Paris, and he took over being emperor again, all without firing a shot.
Incredible.
So it's this great romantic story. It leaves out the part that 100 days later was the Battle of Waterloo, and he lost again and was sent off to St. Helena Island. But when I first started to figure out how I was going to write Clisson, how I was going to ghostwrite for Napoleon, and that was originally my whole intention, was just to write Clisson, to finish that novel for him.
Interesting.
That was going to be my novel. I've started reading many biographies of him and just book after book after book, and I couldn't find the man in it. I couldn't find exactly who he really was as a person. Mm-hmm. So that was what intrigued me.
So is much of, because I found him to be fairly likable, right? I found him to be fairly likable in your novel. And so one of the questions I had along these lines then was, is that her imagination of him, or is that based on what you could find in historical records, or a little bit of both? And it's not like he was an angel. I'm not saying that. It's not like he was just a nice guy, but overall, I found him likable in the novel. And I don't know if that was the right reaction or not. Maybe I have Napoleonic, whatever. But thoughts on that? Did you, as far as the personality that you ended up coming up with for the novel?
I did find him likable personally. Also, there are times when I really dislike him.
Well, you're right. Sir, he has his moments. He has his moments. Like I said, I'm not saying he was an angel, but yeah.
But he is a person. He is extremely bright. He is a person who is witty. In my novel, I freely make use of many quotes that either he actually said or have been attributed to him, and often put them. I use them in different contexts than they might have been used otherwise. But you can see he talks in a way that is very interesting. He tends to use very short, brief sentences and be terse, and then also at the same time go on for sort of a lush, romantic way in which he talks. And he did do both. That was what I found about him. Mm-hmm. And for someone like me who doesn't speak French absolutely fluently, it was a pleasure to read Napoleon because, as you know, the French can be very complicated. It's a complicated conceptual language. And you can know every word in a sentence and have no idea what that sentence means.
Especially when it was written 150 years ago.
Well, French hasn't changed that much. But for Napoleon, it was his second language. He grew up speaking, or his third, he grew up speaking Corsican. Italian and Corsican.
Right.
And it wasn't until he was 9 years old that he learned French. So in fact, his French is much easier to read than
because it's a non-native, right?
Right.
Even if it's really fluent, it's non-interesting. Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
So it's much more straightforward. Mm-hmm. So I found by reading a lot of his things he had written himself, that was where I found the Napoleon that I was looking for.
Mm-hmm. And makes sense. Makes sense.
And, you know, as I said, he was thought to be extremely ruthless. On the other hand, he forgave almost everybody every time they would betray him. He was betrayed by generals. He was betrayed by his family. He was betrayed by his lovers and his wives. And he always forgave them, very uncorsican, at least in terms of stereotypical.
Right. The vendetta, right.
But that was another very likable thing about him, was that he could rise above it.
Right. And that's a recurring theme throughout the book. Something else that was likable that, again, I had the same question with regards to, was this her sort of imagining of Napoleon, or was this based on what she discovered in her research, is his tenderness and love of children. Was that, and I know where that could have come from, but yeah, can you speak to that?
Yes, that's very real. I think it comes from a couple places. One is that he really never had a childhood in many ways. He was 9 years old when he was sent from his family to French military school. And, you know, in those days, you didn't go back and forth for the holidays or anything. He didn't go home from the time he was 9 years old until he was 17. He saw his parents just a couple of times for a day. His father, I think, twice, his mother once, during that whole time.
Wow.
He was in that school where he was an outsider because he was Corsican, because he was poor, and he was in a school that was, both schools that he went to were for aristocrats' children. So here, I think, is where part of his disconnect with his emotional disconnect to people may come from. But he loved children. He loved his nieces and nephews. He loved to play with them. He wanted a child very badly, particularly not just to carry on his dynasty, which he did want a child for, but also because he desperately loved children. So that's a very real thing.
Interesting.
You know, one of the stories about that is that he really did, when the King of Rome, his child, the eaglet, was born, his only legitimate son, his second wife, Marie Louise, who was giving birth to that child, was having a terrible time. And they were afraid that she was going to die. And he said, save the mother. Let the child die. That's right. You know, so he was very emotionally attached to people that he got attached to.
Right.
But then he could also withdraw from them.
Right. Let's talk about another kind of attachment that we just touched on, or you just touched on a second ago, which is his attachment to Corsica, the fact that he was Corsican. And for maybe 3/4 of the book, and so the novel itself, and then also Clisson, the novel within the novel, he is very, very proud of being Corsican, and also identifies as not being French, even when he's at the École Militaire and he's in the French military school. Do we know, just from historical, when and how he transitioned from being defiantly identified as Corsican to French? Is there one moment that we can trace back to that, or was it? Can we just assume it was? Oh, there is. Okay, yes. Yeah. Can you shed some light on that?
Yes, Corsica rejected him. That's really what happened. And again, it's kind of a long, convoluted story. Every story about Napoleon is long and convoluted, so I'll compress it. So those of you anybody who listens to this who knows all the facts, forgive me.
Fast forward. You can fast forward this 2 minute piece. Yeah. So go ahead.
Okay. So Napoleon went back to Corsica. He was there during much of the French Revolution, the beginning of the French Revolution. Which part of kept him from getting into too much trouble, maybe during that. We can come back to that in a second. But he and his brother got into politics in Corsica. And the Corsican leader at the time, Paoli, rejected his help. He and his brother ended up on the wrong side of the political fights going on. And they were, in effect, they and all their family had to slip out of Corsica. Their house and all their property was seized and torn apart. They slipped out with nothing but what they had on their backs, and got to France and lived in Marseille. Mm-hmm. And he went back into the army again and became really the breadwinner to the family until. Well, forever, because
when you're emperor,
you're really
you have means. You have means, yes,
right. But at that point, he was still a young
General.
poor officer. But it was really that Corsica rejected him.
Interesting.
He then, that's the point at which he became French. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He stopped in Corsica one time after that, and that was it. He never went back any other time.
Wow.
And he gave them no special privileges when he was an emperor either.
Yeah, well, he's got a grudge to bear. Clearly, they kicked him out. One thing that I loved and was surprised to read I think this was in the author's notes, was you debunk a very popular myth, sort of a tall tale, if I may be ironic, a tall tale.
Yes, I got it.
Yeah. Can you speak to that? Because I was so surprised. And I'm curious, can you speak to what that is, but then also the genesis of that myth to the extent that we know what the genesis of it might have been?
Okay. I'm assuming that you're talking about the fact that Napoleon was not really short.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Yes.
So Napoleon was between 5'6" and 5'7", and that was average height for a Frenchman of his time. And not that unusual today for anybody, right?
Right.
So now I will have to just slip into here that I am about 5'1". So maybe I have a little bone to pick with.
Fair enough.
But anyway,
fair enough. Yeah.
So the story about him being short comes from several different ways. One, probably the very first, is that the British used it as propaganda. They made it into a big propaganda thing. So in their cartoons, he was this little short guy with a great big hat and high boots, if you look at the cartoons from their time. And John Bull, who was the representative of England, that was their character, was a great big tall guy. So Napoleon was short for that reason. Napoleon was also viewed as short because his one of the other reasons that's attributed to this is that his personal guard were all people who are over 6 feet. So he looked short next to them.
Interesting.
Then in time, what we have is this it sort of gets compounded upon. Even Tolstoy wrote about how small his hands were. Because Tolstoy hated Napoleon because he actually hated Napoleon III, his nephew, and we don't need to go into that either. But anyway, but it's in War and Peace, and that propagates it more. And then in the 20th century, a Dr. Adler, I guess his name was, I can't think of his first name, a psychiatrist, wrote about the Napoleonic complex. And so he took all of this information and he then applied it to the fact that short people are ambitious.
Oh my God.
Overly ambitious.
So unfair. Unfair. Yeah. I love that though. That's so fascinating. And
yes.
then, yeah.
So,
Um,
so it's lasted ever since.
yeah. Yeah. So unfair. So unfair. I love that it started as propaganda. I mean, I love it and I hate it. It's horrible, but it's fascinating. I love it in the sense that that's fascinating. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
Were there any, and the answer to this might be no, but were there any other big misconceptions like that you uncovered during your research, or is that kind of the main big surprise insofar as that at that level?
Well, I guess I would say this, that, and I didn't, this is not something that I learned, that I discovered any more than Clisson is a novel that I discovered. That was historically known.
Yeah.
So just want to make sure that there's no belief.
I don't know. That would be good. We could give you a lot more credit. We could say discovered this novel. That'd be a great marketing point.
I finished it for him though.
You finished it. That's
what I did.
That works.
I took that novel, and it was about 15 pages, as I said, and I made it in the book. It's about 120 of the book.
Yeah.
And as you said, it's a novel within the novel.
Right.
With him looking back on his life.
Right.
The other things that I think are that Americans don't know is, number one, Americans only think of Josephine as his wife, the great love affair of Napoleon and Josephine. And it was a great love affair for some years. They both cheated on each other. She cheated first. But Napoleon divorced Josephine. And most Americans wouldn't know that. Mm-hmm. And he married the daughter of the Emperor of Austria. He was about 40. She was about 18. Nothing new in that, though, from the time.
Right.
That was what a princess was supposed to do.
Right.
Right. And they were in love. Marie Louise was her name. Seemingly in love. As soon as he started doing badly, she started cheating on it. She left him. She deserted him, ran off with a Austrian colonel who supposedly had been sent to seduce her and to do exactly that, to get her and Napoleon's son back to Austria. She lived with this colonel for all the time that Napoleon was in exile. Had 3 children by him, and after Napoleon died, she married him. Mm-hmm. So that's a story of betrayal of Napoleon that probably few people know.
Right.
The other thing that really Americans don't know is most Americans don't know about St. Helena Island. Mm-hmm. If you ask them about exile for Napoleon, they think of the Mediterranean island of Elba,
right,
where he was for 10 months until, as I said, he escaped and went back to France and took over again.
Yep.
So if you want to talk about St. Helena, whenever you're ready.
Hold that thought. We're definitely going to talk about St. Helena, but I want to talk about another woman first. And, because we mentioned her at the very beginning, but I do want to circle back because in addition to it, the book being a novel within a novel, it's also told from two different perspectives. And one of them, you mentioned Albine, but can you tell us a little bit more about who she was and how she fits into the story? Okay.
Yes. So just again, sort of to describe the book, is that the overarching part of the book is Napoleon's time on St. Helena. The Clisson, the finishing of Napoleon's youthful novel, comes in that older defeated emperor looking back on his youth and finishing his youthful novel, but from his perspective as the older man. Then we have the point of view of Albine, of Countess Albine de Montholon, who is one of Napoleon's followers. She and her husband went with Napoleon, among other people, to St. Helena Island. And she's a woman. I personally love her. I hope you did. She's sort of a
fun.
Scamp.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely.
She's a bit of a scamp, and because she's not as well known in many ways as Napoleon, and there's less facts known about her, I was able to take more fictional liberties with her than in many ways I could have with Napoleon. So, but she did. Everybody, you never can know what happened in somebody's bedroom unless one or the other of them really wrote about it. And in the memoirs from St. Helena, that there are many of all the people who went there. Everybody's lying. So you have to be careful what you believe. But it is firmly believed that she had an affair with Napoleon with her husband's knowledge. And I don't know if I want to give the spoiler or not, but
think carefully. Don't give the spoiler.
Yes, I won't give the spoiler.
I'm gonna help you with that. Don't give the spoiler.
Okay. So it is her perspective on Napoleon, and I wanted to put her voice in there because also partially because I really liked her as a character and I wanted to bring her forward, but also because she provides a perspective on Napoleon as a person that you could not see unless you were seeing it through her eyes.
Right.
So that's her literary use.
Right. Thank you. And you did say, that her life is mostly imagined because there's not as much information in the historical records about her. So let's talk a little from a craft perspective. Let's switch and talk a little bit about historical fiction itself. Yeah. You say in the author's notes, you say, quote, historical fiction is the line between what did happen and what might have happened, which I think is a great way of putting it. How can you tell us a little bit more, again, from a craft perspective, how you blended the two? Bringing in the fact and then, and how did you know? Because it seems to me as if I were writing historical fiction, even though it's fiction, and I think you just touched on this, when you're talking about the facts, you probably still have to get the facts part right. But then how do you know when you get to bring in the fiction? How does it all mix together?
Well, that's the art of it, isn't it?
It is.
And everybody does it a little bit differently, and so there's a continuum there. And you can find people who will not change any fact whatsoever, or even tell any, and want to make sure that every piece of dialogue is documented. So there's that level of historical fiction. That's barely fiction at all.
Yeah.
And then you can go all the way to the other side where you have alternative fiction, where, I don't know, where Germany wins World War II, right?
Yeah, a whole genre.
Right. So you can go into something totally different. I'd say that I am in the middle, but maybe I'm sort of in the middle of those, in that I would never have it say in my book that Napoleon was reinstated from St. Helena as Emperor of the French. Mm-hmm. So what you find in Wikipedia that he died on St. Helena, well, he's going to die on St. Helena because that would be changing real history, big history in a way. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't stop me from taking the conspiracy theory about whether or not Napoleon was murdered on St. Helena, whether or not he was poisoned with arsenic on St. Helena. And that's been a conspiracy theory that's been in place for, I guess, a couple centuries that happened. And there are a lot of choices as to who did that, including Albine's husband is often called the person who did that, is set out as being the person who did it. I took the fact that we don't know what happened with that, but that there's a conspiracy theory about it. And I used it in a different way.
So where there's doubt, there were opportunities for the creativity and for the imagination.
Exactly. And on top of that, there's so for example, there's also a character in there called Cipriani, who is Napoleon's childhood friend, who's with him on St. Helena. Well, that's a real character. And that real character on St. Helena, there's very little known about, except that he did grow up on Corsica, that he was a family friend. There are rumors that he was Napoleon's half-brother, all sorts of things like that. But what gave me the opportunity to tell the story that I did was because he died very suddenly on St. Helena, and his grave is not known.
Mm-hmm, really?
So there you have a great opportunity to say, let's see what happened.
Right.
Let's make a story as to what happened with it. with this character.
I love it.
I'm going to tell you one other thing that I did, if you don't mind.
That's why we're here.
Okay. After visiting St. Helena, and because of the issues with Napoleon and Haiti, I felt it was important to give the people of St. Helena, who include the slaves who were on there during the time that Napoleon was there, to give them a voice that is rarely heard at least in Napoleonic stories about St. Helena. So I did create a story. I built on facts. I built on people that were knowledgeable, that were there, that were real. And I extended the story to what could have been. And that was an effort to be able to tell a little bit about the story and to bring to light some about what happened on Haiti and what was going on St. Helena with the British and slavery at the time of Napoleon. And at the time I did that, that's now become something that's pretty well known, partially because of the 200th anniversary of Napoleon's death. And there was a lot of kerfuffle, and particularly, and it's a bigger term than that, but I don't mean to minimize it, particularly in France, as to whether or not he should be commemorated because of what he did on Haiti, if nothing else.
Right.
But when I started writing that, it was 2015 when I put more and more of that into the story, long before. And so I was not anticipating that everybody would know it. I thought I was being clever.
Right. Well, and you were, right. And you were, but it just so happens that it was rising up elsewhere as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was, I thought that I really enjoyed those characters, first of all. And secondly, it was interesting too, because it shed light on the conflict, at least according to how you tell the story, that Napoleon felt relative to that, with regards to slavery and his huge mistake in Haiti. So it also kind of helped from that perspective, I thought. So we keep talking about St. Helena, but I want to talk about just travel in general, because like I said in your bio in the beginning, including St. Helena, you traveled 30,000 miles for this book. So can you tell us the role that travel played, particularly St. Helena, but also I think you went to Corsica. I know you definitely went to France multiple times. So can you tell us about the role travel played in how it influenced the book?
Sure. As you mentioned early on, I am a traveler, a lifetime traveler. I love to travel. I think I am a very visual and visceral consumer of information that allows me to be able to write, or of experiences. So to me, being there makes the difference. So I can describe Napoleon's school time experiences, both because I've studied them and learned about them, but I've been in that school and I've been in that town, and I can see it in my mind. I can feel it. With St. Helena in particular, it was an amazing voyage there. I had to get there, well, almost the same way Napoleon did, because of the time. It's an island in the middle of the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles off the coast of Africa, 1,800 miles off the coast of Brazil, and south of the equator. So it's in the middle of literally nowhere. And at the time I went there, it didn't have an airport at all. They were just beginning to decide to figure out whether or not they could build one there. So the only way to get there was by flying to Cape Town, South Africa, and then taking a 5-day voyage on what was at that point the only ship that went to St. Helena on any kind of a regular basis. It was one of the last of the British mail ships, a transport ship, that took about 60 passengers, and then anything else the island needed. If it was a set of tires, if it was sea batteries, if it was the book that you ordered from Amazon, it was going to
Right.
get there that way.
That
right?
was the one way. The one
if
way.
it was
Either
a
that or
cow.
albatross.
Right. Right. If it was a cow or a goat, it was going to get there that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I took that ship there, and we stayed 9 days before the ship went on and to Ascension Island, then came back and got us again and took us 5 days back to South Africa. The island has the three important Napoleonic locations that have been preserved and restored quite lovingly by the French who owned them. It's still a British island, still an outer territory of the British. One is the very first place that Napoleon stayed, which was called the Briars, and that plays a good part in the book. And then there is the house that he lived in for most of the time, for about 5 years, and where he died. And then there is the place where he was first buried, and where he stayed buried between 1821 when he died and 1840 when his body was moved to Paris. So those are, and all those places show up in the book in great detail. When I was starting to write this book, and I was starting to try to write the parts about St. Helena, I really was struggling. I just couldn't see the place.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to my husband, I'll never forget, I went to my husband and said, I'd really like to go to St. Helena.
As you do. He's between that and Florida that year?
Yeah. I don't think I can write this book without doing that. And he said, well, okay, as long as if we go to Africa, if we stay in Cape Town for a week and we get to go shark diving.
Yes, I want something out of this deal. I want something out of this deal.
Then I'll go. So we did that, and we went great white shark diving. But the place where he lived, Longwood House, I had written ahead to the French consul who runs those places on St. Helena, asking him, explaining what I wanted. And he allowed me to be alone in that building and walk through the rooms and just soak up the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They still feel like he's there. They're still musty. They still have some of his things around. They've actually done more in the last few years since I was there. And Michel de Martineau said, the guy who runs it, said that some people complain that it's been spruced up too much. It doesn't, but I will say, and once again, this comes back to fiction writers, that I don't believe in ghosts, but I felt a presence there.
I love that. Yeah. You also said that you found the driving force for the novel there. And so what did you mean specifically when you said that, the driving force of the novel?
What I would say is that what I meant by that is what I felt about the human being and the presence of that person, that I felt a very large, deep, call it a soul, I don't know what you want to call it, spirit, complex. I feel as though I soaked up the person there, that all the things I'd learned coalesced while I was standing there where he died.
Is it fair to say that it became more real for you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All of these characters, by the way, become very real to me. I mean, sorry, but I know them better than I know almost any human being.
Yes.
I probably know them better than I know myself, in a sense.
That's part of the fun. Absolutely.
Right. And I love them, all of them, the heroes and the villains. I love them all. And I think if you don't, that it must be very difficult to write about them as people.
Right.
So
I love that. Yeah, no, I love that. Okay, just two more things I'm going to ask you relative to craft, because we are nearing the end of our time, unfortunately. But there are two more things I'm just curious about. One is, we talked about Aldine and how the story is told from her perspective. Something we didn't specifically talk about, though, that was interesting to me, again, from a craft perspective as a writer, is you chose for her to tell her story in first person, but Napoleon's story is told in third person. So I was just curious about that choice and if that was difficult at all for you to go back and forth between those two voices.
Okay, well, so I guess first of all, you need to know that wasn't how that I tried it a variety of different ways. Okay, so at one point I tried to write Napoleon first person, and that wasn't going anywhere.
Yeah.
I simply couldn't do it. It was a step too far. So I left him in third person. Albine, when I first wrote this whole book, was not in first person.
Really?
She was, in fact, she wasn't as big a character in the book. She just simply was a character in the book, mostly really told from Napoleon's third person point of view.
Interesting.
Then in revisions, she started to become more and more important to me and more important to the story. And as I started to bring her forward, her voice sort of coalesced in my head. And the only way to express things really in her point of view, in that voice that I was developing in my head, was to put her into first person. It was no problem for me to move back and forth. I would have to say it's not a problem to write one portion in first person, because as soon as I moved into her part of it, I was in her head and seeing things from her perspective.
Yep.
And because she has a unique, quirky perspective on life, and a very distinct character,
yes.
I didn't find it at all hard.
I thought it was particularly effective when something would happen on the Napoleon side of the house, so to speak, and then we would immediately, occasionally get her perspective on what had just happened in the first person. I found some of those moments were just really, just it was really nice to get her, because like you said, she is a little quirky. She's got a lot of personality, and so it was always nice to have that contrast with those moments. And yeah, just being in her head was fun. And and like you also said, I mean, I totally agree that it gave a different perspective on Napoleon as well, which was helpful and interesting.
Right, but she also had her own character arc, which, as you,
absolutely,
as you know from having read it, her character arc goes beyond Napoleon's,
absolutely, and
continues on to the future, so that she has a full story to tell about herself.
Right.
That is, I felt, it's a contrast to Napoleon's for how you feel about power, because she had been very attracted to power, and that was what got her where she was. And then she has to make some decisions about that.
Yep.
And that's that. So I felt like it was good contrast there.
I couldn't agree more. I enjoyed both of those perspectives. Yes, I did.
It really makes me happy.
Well, good. It made me happy too. So the last thing I'm going to ask you about craft is, again, just going back to the fact that it is a novel within a novel, Clisson, the novel that Napoleon began writing and that started you off on this book. Was that tricky at all? Because one thing that I was also impressed with while I'm complimenting the book, something else that I was generally impressed with that could have been tricky was the transitions between his book and your book, right? The main book. And to me, those transitions really worked. So were there pretty, very fluidly. So were there any challenges to that, to doing the book within the book, and how, can you talk just a little bit without any spoilers about how your Clisson is different from the original?
Sure. So the truth is that was hard.
Yep.
That was hard to do, and you have to do it because it's not like it's the novel within the novel all in one big bunch. it's interspersed. You've got Napoleon's point of view, you've got him writing Clisson, and you've got Albine's point of view, and it bounces back and forth amongst those. Most chapters have all three in them. So the transitions to Clisson took a lot of work, partially because what was happening in Clisson had to be reflective of what was happening in the main story, because it was Napoleon saying, okay, this just happened to me, and now I'm going to try to write a little bit about it, but I'm going to write it from the perspective of Clisson.
Right.
So you had to have him transition into wanting to write, and then whatever he wrote had to have some relationship to what was going on in his life. Again, that took a lot of time, a lot of effort. The Clisson I wrote originally was about 50 pages longer.
Really? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
it's always so hard. Yeah, it's so hard to get rid of those pages.
Yeah.
I mean, was it hard? Is that?
Yeah. Well, I wrote a lot more about his youth. In Clisson is also the love affairs that he has during that time. He's in love with two different women in Clisson, or Clisson, who is really Napoleon,
right?
Is in love. Napoleon is a young man, is in love with two different women, and I had to cut some things that I did have to cut some things that I loved there. As a matter of fact.
Kill your darlings. Sometimes we have to kill our darlings.
Yeah, but that it took a lot of work, and it took a lot of rewrites to get those transitions right. More than it took. It was harder to do that than it was to pop into Albine's head.
Right.
And have her look at things
from her perspective.
So
right.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I'm a slow writer. I like to write. I like to look at every single word and write it over and over and over again. So it was both a joy. The whole writing the whole thing was, in fact, the most intellectually and emotionally satisfying thing I've ever done in my life. And
I love
had
it.
A big business career, and
right.
So I've done a lot of other things, but this was really emotionally and intellectually fascinating to me.
And it is for the readers. So thank you very much
you.
For that. There's so much more I would love to ask, but of course, like I said, we're coming to the end of our time here. But I know that you're working on another book, and it takes place in the similar time period. So do you just want to give us a tidbit of what that is, so that we can know what's coming next from you?
Yes. So it's French Revolution. It is. I'm interested in the French Revolution partially because I'm interested in French history, because I know all these people, because I have an understanding of that time and can write it without having to start all over and learn a new time. But I'm also interested in it because of the potential for parallels to our own time from a social and political time standpoint, whereas I'm always interested in how stability turns into anarchy. I just came back from Rwanda, where 27 years ago, almost overnight, it seemed like, but not really when you learn the history. It turned into genocide of your neighbors killing neighbors and your friends killing friends, and whole families wiped out. And these things happen in civilization. I can't tell you how many genocide and Holocaust museums I've been to all across the world.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a part of us. Maybe when we first did in the Neanderthals as Homo sapiens, and we killed all those Neanderthals off. So, and I still think we could turn like that.
Mhm,
I think
mhm.
even the United States can turn like that. Western Europe could turn like that. So I want to look at that. And
Right.
I will also be able to draw in some of my favorite characters from this. Napoleon, Josephine,
Mhm,
maybe
mhm.
Albine might show up.
Oh, even
So
Albine. Albine might reappear.
yes,
Look for more from Albine.
yeah, so that's my story. And also um yeah, so I want to find hope in the violence.
Mhm. And learn from the
And
past.
yes, I want to bring the hope back out. So
That's a
my-
perfect place to end. Let's end this with hope. We have hope.
we do.
Margaret, c'était un vrai plaisir. Merci d'être
Merci
venue.
bien.
À vous. Finding Napoleon is out now. Where can people go to find out more?
Finding Napoleon. Well, you can go to my website, which is, you can go there by just calling it findingnapoleon.com, or margaretrodenberg.com, but Finding Napoleon is probably easier to spell. And you also can find it in your local bookstores, on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, wherever fine books are sold, we hope.
There we go. Wherever
So,
fine books are sold, and it is a
yes,
fine
and I
book.
do thank the San Francisco Writers Conference for all they did for me early in my career, and for all the wisdom I gained, because even though I'm in Virginia, I went to many of their conferences, and really did learn a lot, and appreciate all that Laurie McLean has done for me and for other writers too.
Awesome.
So.
All right. Well, thanks again, Margaret. I'm Matthew Félix. More about me at matthewfelix.com, and more about the San Francisco Writers Conference, which is taking place in person, knock on wood, in 2022. And you can register now. So please go to sfwriters.org and find out everything that's going on, including next year's conference. And until next time, thanks for joining us.